The water came up out of the ground the color of poured silver, and 26 cattle stood knee-deep in it, while the whole valley behind them cracked and died of thirst. A woman knelt at the edge of that new-made pool with her hands sunk to the wrist in mud that ought to have been dust, and she was laughing and crying at the same time in the way that only exhaustion allows. 2 counties over, men who had once laughed at her were driving their thin herds to the railhead to sell them for the price of the freight. But here, in the low sink of land that everybody swore held nothing but alkali and heartbreak, the water rose and rose and would not stop rising. It is a strange thing to watch a person be proven right. Rarer still to watch the land itself do the proving. 3 springs earlier, none of this had a shape yet, and the woman who would kneel in that silver water was only a name the town used when it wanted to feel wise at someone else's expense. Her name was Ada Merritt, and in the spring she turned 26. Chersey had $41 to her name, a wagon with a cracked axle, and a father 3 months in the ground. The Merritt place had never been much, a quarter section of hard yellow grass at the dry end of the Sabine bench, and her father had worked it 40 years to arrive at nothing but debt. When the bank took the good half of the land to settle what he owed, Ada was left with the worthless half, the low sink they called the bowl, a shallow depression of white-crusted soil where nothing grew but greasewood and the memory of failure. The men in town told her plainly what she already knew. A young woman alone could not run a place like that. She had no husband, no brothers, no backing, and no sense, they said. Or she would have taken the bank's small offer and gone to the city to work as somebody's girl. Ada listened to all of it with her hat in her hands and her jaw set, and she said thank you, and she did not go. She had watched her father read the land his whole life, and she had learned one thing he never quite understood himself. The land was always saying something. Most people simply were not patient enough to listen. The cattle came to her by accident, the way most of the important things in a life arrive. There was a drover named Coyle passing through that April with a string of animals he had bought cheap and could no longer feed, for the grass had come in poor everywhere, and the price of hay had climbed past cents. 26 head he had, and they were a sorry sight, ribs like the staves of a barrel, hides dull, eyes gone patient, the way a starving animal's eyes go when it has given up on being angry. Coyle wanted rid of them before they dropped in his tracks and cost him the skinning. He stood in the road and named a price, and nobody would take them, for who feeds 26 dying cows on grass that will not grow? Ada looked a long time at those animals. She counted them twice, slow, and she looked at the way they held their heads, and she looked at the ground, and something moved in her that she could not yet put words to. She offered him $35. Coyle laughed, because $35 was an insult and a mercy at once, and he took it, because a mercy was more than anyone else had offered. He signed the bill of sale on the tailgate of his wagon, and he drove off, whistling like a man who has fooled somebody, and the whole town agreed that this time Ada Merritt had truly lost her mind. She had spent nearly her whole fortune on death that had not finished happening yet. Old Nils Bergen was the only soul who did not laugh. He had a place adjoining hers, a stony scrap he had wrestled a living from for 30 years since he came over from the old country with a wooden trunk and a way of speaking that turned every plain thing into something that sounded like scripture. He came walking across the property line the evening she brought the cattle home, and he leaned on the fence and watched her fret over the poor bony things, and after a long while he said, "Land does not lie, girl, but it whispers, and a person must go down on the knees to hear it." Ada asked him what that was supposed to mean, and he only smiled the way old men smile when they have said a true thing too soon for it to be understood. Then he did a useful thing instead of a wise one. He helped her rig a lean-to against the wind, and he showed her how to boil greasewood bark to a tea that eased the scours in a starving animal, and he told her that the first weeks were the whole war. "Keep them alive to summer," he said, "and summer will tell you what you have bought." He did not tell her what she had bought, because he did not yet know either, but he had lived long enough on hard ground to believe that a low place holds what the high places lose, and he watched the bowl the way other men watched the sky. That first month was arithmetic, and the arithmetic was cruel. Ada sat at the kitchen table each night with a stub of pencil, and did the sums by lamplight, the way her father never had 26 head, each one wanting near 30 pounds of feed a day to come back to flesh. And she had a barn, with perhaps 3 weeks of poor hay in it, and $41 minus 35, which left 6, and $6 does not buy a summer. She cut the sums down and down. She could not feed 26 to fatness. But she could keep 26 alive if she let them range the worthless bowl and forage what the greasewood offered, thin as it was, and if she carried water to them by hand from the seep at the north corner, a slow, miserable trickle that gave a barrel a day if she was patient. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough, and yet she counted the animals every morning, and every morning there were still 26, and not one had died in the night, and she let herself believe that meant something. She named them, which the town would have mocked her for worse than the buying. She named them after the days she had left them alive, so that a red heifer was called Tuesday, and a broad-backed steer was called March, and the naming was a way of promising each of them out loud that she meant for them to see the summer. Here is a thing that is easy to forget when you are down at the bottom of your own life. Cattle are not stupid, and a thirsty animal is a diviner of the oldest kind. Ada began to notice, in the second week of May, that the herd did not scatter across the bowl to graze the way scent said they should. They gathered. Every morning they drifted to the same low knot of ground near the center of the sink, a patch of white-crusted earth she had always taken for the deadest part of a dead place, and there they stood, and there they pawed. She thought at first it was habit, or foolishness, or the last confusion of hungry beasts. She would drive them off toward the greasewood, and by afternoon they had wandered back to that one spot and stood over it with their heads down, and some of them would strike at the ground with a forehoof, again and again, patient and stubborn, as though they were knocking on a door. Old Nils came by and watched them do it, and grew very quiet. He crouched and pressed his palm flat to the crusted white ground where the hooves had scored it, and he held it there a long moment, and then he stood up slower than he had crouched down. "Girl," he said, and his voice had gone careful, "what does the ground feel like to you here?" Ada knelt and put her own hand where his had been. The rest of the bowl was warm with the sun and dry as a lie, but this patch was cool. Cool and faintly when she pressed, damp, the way the underside of a stone is damp when you turn it over. She did not dare hope yet. Hope was a thing she had learned to ration as carefully as feed. But she began to watch the spot, and she began to watch the cattle watch it, and one evening, near the end of May, she took her father's spade out to the center of the bowl, in the last of the light, and she drove it into the white ground where the hooves had worn a shallow saucer, and she began, alone, to dig. The crust broke hard, an inch of it, too, and beneath the crust the soil turned darker and then darker still, and the smell that came up out of the hole was not the dead mineral stink of alkali but something green and cold and living, the smell of deep water that has never seen the sun. She dug until she could not lift the spade, until her hands had gone raw and then numb, until the dark was full and the stars were out, and she was down past her knees in a hole that was slowly, unmistakably, filling with water from below. Not seeping in from the sides the way a ditch fills. Rising, pushing up from the bottom against her spade, with a faint, steady pressure, as if something patient and enormous had been waiting under that worthless land the whole time for someone with sense enough to knock. She sat back on her heels in the cold mud, and she laughed until she wept. And the cattle came and stood around her in the dark, 26 of them, breathing, and she understood that they had known before she did. Nils came at first light because he had seen her lamp out in the bowl half the night and worried. He found her still there, soaked and filthy and grinning like a fool, sitting beside a pool the size of a wagon bed that had not existed the evening before. He looked at the water. He knelt, and he cupped it, and he tasted it, and he was still a long moment, and then he said a word in his old language that she did not know, soft. The way a man says a prayer he had forgotten, he remembered. "Artesian," he said at last. The word for it is Artesian, There is water down under this whole country, girl, trapped in the rock and pressed hard by the high ground far off. And where the ground is thin enough and low enough, it wants to come up, your bowl. He gestured at the whole white dead sink of it. Your worthless bowl is the one thin place for 40 miles. The high ground is a roof over the water everywhere else. Here, it is a door. He looked at her the way you look at someone whose luck has turned so hard it frightens you. You did not buy dying cows, he said. You bought the only animals in the county with the wit to find the one thing this land is about to be worth everything for. And Ada, wringing mud from her sleeve, asked the question that would decide the shape of the years to come. What is it about to be worth? And Nils looked at the cloudless, pitiless, beautiful sky, and he said, everything. If the rains fail, and the rains are going to fail, I can smell it. The old country teaches you the smell of a dry year, and I have been smelling it since March. She banked the secret like a coal under ash. This was the hardest wisdom Nils gave her, and the one she trusted least at first, for her whole nature was to be plain and open, and here he was telling her to be sly. Say nothing, he told her. A single woman alone, with the only water in a drought, and a town that already thinks she is a fool. What do you imagine happens the day they learn? They come. Some to buy it cheap before you know its worth, some to take it. And one, mark me, one will come smiling with papers. So through June she said nothing, and she worked. She widened the hole into a proper basin, and shored its sides with stone hauled by the wagon load, and she and Nils built a low earthen wall to hold the rising water and cut a channel to a stock pond so the cattle could drink their fill without fouling the source. And the cattle, drinking clean cold water for the first time in their lives, and grazing the greasewood that greened around the new damp, began to change. Their ribs filled, their hides took a shine. Tuesday, the red heifer, who had been a bag of bones in April, grew broad and glossy and calved a strong bull calf in the middle of July, and Ada wept over that calf the way other women wept over christenings. Basket after basket of stone she hauled, day after day after day, and the water rose to meet the work. And, by the end of July, the bowl that the whole county had called the deadest ground for 40 miles held a pond you could water 200 head at ringed with green. While beyond its low earthen wall, the grass of the whole bench went from yellow to brown to the gray of ash. The drought came the way Nils had said it would, without drama, simply by the rain not falling. July was a furnace with the door left open. The creeks that fed the town dropped and then stopped, showing their cracked stone beds, like the ribs of the starving cattle Ada had bought. And now, the arithmetic that had been so cruel to her turned its cruelty on everyone else. The men who had laughed at her $35 folly stood at their own dry stock tanks and did the sums that she had done in the winter, and the sums came out to ruin. A steer cannot go 3 days without water in that heat. The high wells, drilled into the roof of rock Nils had described, gave dust. Men who had 400 head watched them go down in the field. The price of cattle collapsed as everyone tried to sell at once, and the price of hauling them to water, where water could be found, climbed past what the animals were worth. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it, and so at first the town did not connect the fool woman in the bowl with their own salvation. It was a boy who made the connection, a boy named Emmett, 12 years old, whose father had lost near everything and who had taken to wandering the bench because there was nothing at home but his father's silence. Emmett came over the rise one evening and stood stock still at the sight of it, a green bowl full of fat cattle and silver water in the middle of a dead brown world, and he thought he had died and wandered into a story. Ada did not run him off. She was lonelier than she let herself know, and the boy had a face like her own at that age, all hunger and stubbornness. She put him to work and she fed him, and she asked him nothing about his father, and in a week he was hers, the way a stray dog is yours once you have fed it twice. He was the one who told the town, though not on purpose. He could not help talking about the water, the miracle of it, and word ran through the county, like fire through the dry grass. And then they came, exactly as Nils had said. First, the desperate ones. Neighbors who 3 months before had told her a woman alone could not run a place, and who now stood at her earthen wall with their hats in their hands and their thin cattle dying behind them, and they could not quite meet her eye. It would have been the easiest thing in the world to make them pay. She had the only water. She could have named any price, could have taken their land, their herds, could have watched the men who mocked her crawl. Being right is its own kind of reply, and she had been so thoroughly publicly right that the temptation to make them feel it was a live thing in her chest. She stood on her wall and looked down at the men who had laughed, and she felt the whole weight of the choice come and settle on her alone. She thought about her father, 40 years of work for nothing, dying in debt to men who had water when he did not. She thought about what it does to a place when the strong drink and the weak go dry. How a valley run on that principle eats itself and everyone in it. And she thought about Nils, who had come across her fence with no reason but kindness, and about Emmett, who had had nowhere else to go. So, she did the thing that the town would tell of for the rest of their lives, longer than they told of the water itself. She opened the wall. She let them water their herds, all of them, the mockers and the pitiers alike, for the plain cost of the labor to keep the channels dug, which was to say for nearly nothing. A thing is only worth what others will pay. The town had told her once to explain why her land was worthless. She had learned the deeper half of that lesson, which is that what you charge a drowning man tells the whole world who you are. Forever. The cattle came down to the bowl from every corner of the dying bench, and the water rose to meet them. And it did not run dry, for the door in the rock had been waiting under that land for longer than there had been a county to laugh at anyone, and 26 starving cows had known where to knock. But there is always the one who comes smiling with papers, and Nils had named him before Ada ever saw his face. He arrived in a fine buggy, in the second week of August, a soft-handed man named Pawed, who worked for a land and cattle concern out of the capital, and he had heard, he said warmly, of the remarkable good fortune of this little place, and he had come to help. He praised the pond. He praised her sense. He said it was a shame, a genuine shame, that a woman alone should carry the burden of such a resource in such hard times, with such hard men about, and that his company was prepared to be generous, more than generous, to take that burden off her hands. He named a figure that would have looked like a mountain of money to the Ada Merritt of the previous spring, and he slid the papers across her own kitchen table with the ease of a man who has bought 100 desperate people this way. And Ada, who had learned to listen, listened. She read the papers slow, twice, the way she counted cattle, and she found in the small close print the thing such papers always contain, the clause that gave his company the water rights entire and the right to close the flow to any user they chose, which meant that the moment the drought bit hardest, they would shut the bowl and sell its water back to the dying county at whatever the drowning would pay. She set the pencil down. "Mr. Pawed," she said, "how did you know the count?" He blinked. "The count," he said. Ada tapped the papers. "You wrote in here that the property carries 26 head. I never told your company how many cattle I own. Nobody knew but me, and an old man and a boy. So either you have been out on my land where you had no leave to be, counting my stock through a glass, or you had it from the drover coil, which means your company was watching this ground before there was a drop of water in it, which means you knew what lay under the bowl before I dug one spadeful, and you sold the deed to the rest of my father's land to the bank, knowing you meant to come take the last worthless piece the day it turned to gold." Pruitt's warmth did not so much fall away as freeze in place. And that freezing was all the answer she needed. She had guessed, and she had guessed right, and she stood up from her own table. There were men on that porch now, come to water their herds, the same men who had laughed at her, and they had heard through the open window every word. Pruitt looked at their faces and understood that he had walked into the one place in the county where his smiling papers were worth less than the $35 a fool woman had paid for a string of dying cows. He gathered his documents and he left, and the buggy went fast down the road, and it did not come back. The rains returned at last in the cool of October, gentle and steady, and the creeks filled, and the grass came green over the ash of the ruined summer, and the county lived because a low, worthless sink of white ground had held the door open when the sky slammed shut. But the water in the bowl never stopped, drought or no, for it answered to pressures older than weather. Ada Merritt kept 26 head that first year and 200 the next, and she never once sold the man water for more than the cost of the ditch, and the strange arithmetic of that generosity was that it made her the most trusted person in 3 counties. And trust, she learned, is worth more than any figure Pruitt ever wrote on a page. She bought back her father's land, all of it, from the bank that had thought it was fleecing her, and she paid a fair price and not a penny more, because that was who she had decided to be. Nils lived to see it, and sat many an evening on her porch, saying almost nothing, well satisfied. Emmett grew up on that place, and ran it after her, and now and again a stranger, hearing the tale, would ask her how she had known, that spring, to spend near her whole fortune on death that had not finished happening yet. And Ada would look out over the green bowl and the silver water and the fat, contented cattle, standing knee-deep, where the world had sworn nothing could live, and she would remember an old man leaning on a fence, and she would say only this: "The land does not lie, but it whispers, and you have to be willing to go down on your knees in the mud when everyone you know is laughing, to hear what it has been trying to tell you all along."